session after the speaker's remarks. And once again, this webinar is being recorded. So let me just get us started by flagging that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, women around the world spent more time than men doing unpaid care and domestic work. In the United States, women spent 37% more time on unpaid care than men. This unpaid care work is real and contributes value to the economy and society, but it is not recognized by official statistics. A conservative estimate of the value of women and girls' unpaid care work in the United States is almost $1.5 trillion annually. Now, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and response, people around the world are feeling the pressures of caring for children and other loved ones without paid care services and the support of extended family and social networks. The loss of normal care structures has increased the precarity many already marginalized families face. As the economy begins to reopen, our care structures and services and health realities have not returned to normal. And this has enormous implications for women's capacity to participate in the paid economy. Today, we have 4 speakers with us. They will help us explore answers to the following questions. How is COVID-19 changing the unpaid and underpaid care realities for households and families? How are women from different socioeconomic backgrounds being affected? What has the government done to address unpaid care issues, as well as the issues of underpaid care workers in its COVID-19 pandemic response? And what public policy measures need to be taken to address the unpaid care challenges faced, particularly for groups experiencing social marginalization and inequities prior to the COVID-19 pandemic? To get us started, I will now turn it over to Nicole Mason, President and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She will speak for 10 minutes, providing a sense of what the COVID-19 pandemic has meant for women and children. Thank you, Nicole.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here to be a part of this really important conversation. And I want to thank Oxfam, who's been a partner with us for over the last year and contributed greatly to our work and research around unpaid care. And also to our partners at CLASP and A Better Balance as well. So my name is Nicole Mason, and I lead the Institute for Women's Policy Research. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, IWPR is the nation's preeminent think tank committed to winning economic equity for women and eliminating structural and institutional barriers to women's full participation in the workforce and society. I am a single mother by choice to now 10-year-old twins. Nearly 10 years ago, when I was planning for my maternity leave at a big university in New York City, there was no maternity leave policy. So I cobbled together my sick and vacation leave for a 2.5-month leave. About a month or so before my return to work, I began to research care options for my twins, and I was shocked by the cost. Care for my infants could easily absorb more than 50% of my salary, and in New York City, I looked everywhere. What I learned from those many years ago is that childcare costs most women up to 30% of their income, maybe more for lower wage working women. I also learned that I would be responsible for trying to figure out how to make it work and would not be compensated for any of the unpaid care that I would have to provide for my children or my family. I would be 100% responsible. I recall thinking in those moments, because before that I hadn't had to think much about care, unpaid labor in the same way. And I remember thinking, this is outrageous. And I thought, why? I don't understand why women are not starting a revolution around this. Rather than spark a revolution, I did what most mothers or working women do in my situation. I figured it out. My paternal grandmother, who was coming to stay for a week or two, ended up staying for 18 months, taking care of my children while I worked full time. I counted myself lucky, but I understand and know that many women are not so fortunate. Back then, I treated what was an institutional problem as an individual problem and worked to solve it by myself, internalizing the message that if I didn't figure out how to make it all work, something was wrong with me and not the system. This is not uncommon, and many women, working women, are also in this position. The pandemic has not only exposed the fragility of our economy and healthcare system, but the broken care system in the US as well. It has also brought into focus our deep racial and economic inequalities, exacerbating many of them. The question of care, who does it and who's responsible for it, has never been more meaningful than in this current moment. Across class, race, and sectors, women are struggling with the burden and expectations of unpaid care work. They also have dual roles as caretakers and workers. Before the pandemic, women were already doing double duty between work and their caretaking responsibilities. With schools and daycares closed and elder care facilities risky, many women are doing double duty, as Sheryl Sandberg has said. You've already heard that women in the United States spend 37% more time on household care than their male counterparts, limiting career choices and economic mobility, and affecting their overall health and well-being. Black and Latino women spend nearly twice as much on unpaid household and care work as their male counterparts. The gap is widest among younger women. Young women ages 15 to 24 spend 50 more percent time than men in their peer group on household and care work. And what this tells me is that the expectation that women will perform unpaid care labor and gender roles and expectations happen very early on. A recent study, we can go one more slide, I'm sorry. A recent study found that working women during the pandemic have only been able to do 1 hour of uninterrupted pay work for every 3 hours that men are able to complete during the day. And as a working mother and also responsible for homeschooling or taking care of my children, I know this to be true firsthand. The impossible expectation that women are supposed to continue to produce 40 hours of work a week, as well as provide homeschooling and care for their children or other loved ones at home is just really impossible and unrealistic. Next, at the start of the year, we were celebrating the gains. Made by many women in the workforce. At that time, women made up 51% of the labor force. The booming economy that we were simultaneously celebrating was made possible in part and on the backs of women. At the time, I cautioned a full embrace or celebration. I understood that what the numbers masked was a struggle that many women face to make ends meet or take care of their families. Although women at the time constituted 51% of the workforce, they were also more likely to be in lower wage jobs, have fewer benefits, less job security, and to be economically vulnerable. They also struggled with childcare and other caretaking demands. In other words, everything was not what it seemed. Over the last couple of months, the economy has shed more than 30 million jobs, and women have bore a disproportionate amount of those losses, more than 70%. Nearly 4 in 10 women's jobs have been adversely impacted by the pandemic. The chief reason for this is that women are likely to be employed in the most impacted sectors, such as education, healthcare, hospitality, and leisure. I believe the number is significantly higher because the number does not or fails to account for the women who are employed in the shadow economy or get paid under the table. It's also having a direct impact on the care economy. This is absolutely having a rippling effect. In February, the unemployment rate for women was about 4%. It's now about 15.7%. For Black and Latino women, the numbers are slightly higher, 16.7% and 18.9% respectively. For workers with less than a high school education, the employment rate is nearly 21%. This is disastrous for several reasons, especially in the context of care. Despite gains of in the workforce because of wage inequality and over time, before the pandemic, women have less wealth and savings to ride out an economic downturn. Black women in particular have not been able to recover fully from the recession in 2018. As mentioned previously, they also have less job security, and with schools and daycares closed, many working mothers face a tough choice: provide for their families or stay home to take care of their children. For many women, especially single women-headed households, this is really an impossible choice. We also know that only about 30% of workers can work remotely. And among women who are able to work remotely, they earn higher wages than other women in the workforce. Women in the service sector and in jobs most impacted by the pandemic are least likely to be able to work remotely and earn significantly less. What this means, as Kimberly mentioned earlier, is that the networks that they relied upon before the pandemic to provide care, the shrinkage of available childcare slots, and the closures make it really difficult for women to remain in the workforce. Next, I want to talk a little bit about breadwinner mothers. Breadwinner mothers are women who contribute, or workers who contribute more than 40% of their income to their households. In families with children, 91.3% of parents work outside of the home, and 1 in 2 of more than 30 million families in the US with children under the age of 18 have a breadwinner mother. Black and Latino women are also more likely to be the sole wage earners in their families. Long ago are the days where women's income accounted for a minor share of household income and workforce participation was optional. In addition to being the primary wage earner for their family, many of these women, especially single mothers, are the primary caregivers, not only for their children, but also for their loved ones. And for the women who work more than 2 jobs or a side job to make ends meet, the sources of revenue that they have to be able to cover care or provide care for their families and to make ends meet have all but disappeared. When the stay-at-home orders are lifted and when the economy begins to move, recovery, what we know is recovery will be slow. There will not be a one-for-one replacement for the jobs that were lost. And some businesses will not open. And if stay-at-home orders are lifted and the daycares are closed, slots have disappeared, the summer camps are closed, and schools remain out, women makers may not be able to re-enter the workforce in the numbers pre-pandemic. And many of the care networks have also been disappeared. So before I turn it over, I want to end with a few things that I think we should do. So for the most part, I think we are doing some of the things that we can and should be done to help women workers ride out or recover during the pandemic. So as a result of the pandemic and relief efforts in the CARE Act, we've provided federal paid sick leave to workers, made unemployment insurance more expansive, including workers that were previously excluded, made provisions for caregivers who could not return to work because of caretaking demands, and we've also provided some basic income to most Americans. In the States, we've provided housing and food assistance, not only to those living severely below the poverty line, but to all those that can demonstrate need. And I believe that these are policies or actions that should not only be temporary, but also can be institutionalized. And, you know, just some months ago, we were talking about the ways in which all the policies that are we've enacted during this time of relief and recovery were impossible. And right now, we're doing them. So I'd like to see us institutionalize them. The last thing I like us to think about is about employer-led practices that can support women in the workforce. Flexible work schedules, childcare subsidies and support, and paid sick leave are just a few of those workplace policies that would go a long way to ensuring that women are only able to re-enter the workforce post-pandemic, but are able to stay. And the last thing that I think is really undergirding a lot of the unpaid labor and the expectations upon women is interrogating the gender norms and stereotypes that undergird the policies and practices that make women disproportionately responsible for the lion's share of unpaid care work. The expectations of women are institutionalized and shape employer practices and policies, and the kind of public policies we put forth at the federal and state levels. Lastly, I'd just like to say that as far as I can see, there are about two paths. The first path is rooted in fear and scarcity, going back to the way things were, not fixing the system or the care system. The second one, I think, second path is a bit more progressive, and it's where I think we should all be headed. And I do believe that we have a roadmap here in the work that we're doing so far in terms of making sure that families have the support that they need during the pandemic and post. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. Now let me turn over to Joy Owens, Senior Policy Advisor with Oxfam, who will speak for 10 minutes to share with us how COVID-19 has been affecting women and their families already experiencing precarity in the Gulf region. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you so much. I am Joy Owens. I currently serve as a Senior Policy Advisor and Program Lead in Mississippi and Louisiana. And also, I am a single mother who lives in Mississippi, so I echo Nicole and others about how hard this is personally for me. And as a person who's extremely privileged and well-resourced and works for an organization like Oxfam that has policies in place that give us an opportunity to work and still manage our households. But that is not the case for many of my colleagues and people who are my constituents and people who live in Mississippi. So what I would like to do is share a little bit about Mississippi in particular, our work pre-COVID, give you some information, what we're doing now and where we would like to see this go. And when I talked about my story is unique, it's not unique to many people in Mississippi, as 78,000 households in poverty in Mississippi are headed by single mothers. And that's 78,000, yes. And then also, when we talk about that, Mississippi is one of the only states in the entire country that does not have a pay equity law in the books. So pre-COVID, one of the things that we were really strategic about was building out a women's economic security initiative, and that's locally led by our partners on the ground, the Mississippi Black Women's Roundtable, and other organizations and allies. And what we were trying to do is to educate and inform women in the community about policies and procedures so they could become advocates and advocate at the State House for local state-led policies. So one of the things that we were really vocal about pre-COVID was pushing to have a state pay equity law, a pregnancy accommodations law, and also paid family leave. And as we were pushing during the session, COVID happened. And I think what COVID has done is created a unique opportunity for us to see how important it is to have these policies in place and give us real data for us to show. And so what I wanted to do was share with you briefly about what the numbers show in Mississippi. I said 78,000 households are headed by single mothers and they live in poverty. Also in Mississippi, about 8 out of every 10 cashiers in Mississippi are women. And that's what we see a lot of times with our essential workers. And in Mississippi, they're making $9.01 an hour. And so that just puts things into perspective. So what we're seeing here at the local level is most of our essential workers, they are women, they're not being paid decent wages, and then they're disproportionately being hospitalized. As of April, nearly 60% of people with COVID that were hospitalized in Mississippi were women. And so what have we done with that data? We've used it as an opportunity to lift these stories and tell stakeholders and people who are in positions of power, this is a real example of why this is important, why we need to change some of our state laws that we have in place. And then also on the ground, what we started to do is through our Women's Economic Security Initiative and through our partners, the Mississippi Black Women's Roundtable, the NAACP in Mississippi, and One Voice, we've started to organize Know Your Rights trainings for workers in these essential positions, specifically pregnant women workers, to tell them what their rights are so they can be self-advocates for themselves as well. And so what we've seen is this is an opportunity to create a space where people can learn about their rights and then also use it as we go back into the session, which has recently resumed in Mississippi, to push these policies forward to say, here we have an example of what it would mean to increase the wages, to pay women the same as what you pay men in Mississippi, and then also to create family leave and also pregnancy accommodations, which is what we were doing before, but now we have so many examples of how this is disproportionately impacting women and Black women. And so that's what we're doing locally. And I keep talking about local because I think it's really important to lift the local stories. Over the weekend, I had the opportunity to talk with some of our constituents and folks in the community who are working in the grocery stores, who are not being paid well. And a lot of them, they're scared. They're scared to not go to work because they're living check to check. They're not making any money to make ends meet. And so they're going to work in these really, really terrible conditions that were bad before COVID. Now they're heightened, and they don't have access to childcare. Some of the homes are women that we've talked with in the community. The women are the breadwinners in the family, and they also are trying to provide childcare for multiple it's generational. We've seen women who are 55 and then a grandmother, and then they still have stay-at-home children that live with them who have younger kids. So it's what this has done is it's created an opportunity for us to shape the narrative and create stories that we can tell state legislators. And what we're doing is we're using this to build out our policy agenda. Actually, prior to joining this call, I was on a call with our state house representative. They're having policy conversations on what policies we can push at the state level. And so I think this is a unique opportunity for us to hopefully finally get a pay equity law on the books in Mississippi. Will be the last state to have one, but we're hoping that this will be an opportunity that we can use to heighten the awareness and hold our state legislators accountable and lift our most vulnerable community members who are underpaid and who are often, their voices are not heard in the same way. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Joy. Now I will turn over to Kate Gallagher-Robbins, Director of the Child Care and Early Education with CLASP. She will now speak for 10 minutes to review the needs of child care investments and how to address. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Kimberly, for that warm introduction, and just what a pleasure to be here with such a powerhouse panel on such a timely and important issue. Really excited to be able to talk about the urgent need for childcare funding, which existed definitely before the pandemic and absolutely exists now. So if we could go a couple slides forward, that would be great. So where were we before COVID started? I think it's really important to think about and recognize the fact that childcare was already very precarious. So childcare is a public good. I'm going to say that again. Childcare is a public good. And it supports the economy, it helps parents work, it helps children grow and thrive, but we treat it like it's a private good. And that is a major problem. So childcare is financed primarily through parent fees. And where that leaves us is a system that is starved for support, where parents cannot afford to pay more for childcare, and childcare workers, who are disproportionately women of color, 40% women of color, are paid poverty level wages. So the answer to that is a major federal investment in childcare. But where were we before COVID started? Our major federal program to support childcare, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, only served 1 in 6 eligible children. So not only is the funding inadequate, CLASP's research actually shows it is also inadequately and inequitably distributed. So Latinx and Asian American families are particularly underserved by the Child Care and Development Block Grant. Next slide, please. So that was the pre-COVID landscape, and it was not good. And given the shaky foundations, it's no surprise that COVID-19 has rocked the childcare system to its core. So childcare has been shuttered across the country, or it is operating under very reduced enrollment. I think new data on this situation are challenging to find, and so we're very grateful to our partners at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, who have done a number of surveys and found that at the moment, at least 100,000 providers are closed across this country. And those who are open are typically operating at 50% or less than their usual enrollment. And the April jobs data that came out just a few weeks ago show us that the damage to the sector is already very severe. So in April, just 1 month, 1/3 of jobs in the childcare sector were lost. We don't have the data yet on the distribution of that for workers of color, but we know by the demographics of the industry that that is disproportionately harming women of color and, of course, their families for that loss of income. Next slide, please. So we need to do something about this. I'm just going to put that right out there, and I hope you guys are with me when we get to the asks at the end of this. The dire figures that we have make it really, really clear that we have to invest quickly and we have to invest substantially to avoid permanent damage to the sector. So what do I mean by substantially? Well, we're talking about $50 billion. So CLASP, my organization, as well as the National Women's Law Center and former Council of Economic Advisors economist, Erin Sojourner, put out an estimate last month that looked at what would it mean to keep childcare providers afloat who are closed during the pandemic and care for the children of essential workers like grocery store workers, healthcare workers, who need to be working during this time and need to have a safe and healthy place for their children to go. It would be $9.6 billion each month. And if we reopen sooner, as many states are trying to do at the moment, in order to care for children in safe and healthy ways, as well as care for children who are typically in school but may not be right now, the costs would be even higher. So this is why we and hundreds of other state, national, and local organizations, as well as dozens and dozens of members of Congress, are advocating for $50 billion in dedicated direct public funding to support the childcare sector's urgent needs. And that's just to get us through the coronavirus. Let us not forget how bad things were before we started. We are coming back to ask you for more money to treat childcare the way it always should have been treated all along. So that's why we're very excited. I don't know if folks saw in the New York Times this morning, Senator Warren, Representative DeLauro, and other key childcare leaders in Congress are on the verge of releasing a $50 billion childcare relief bill today. So this is a real moment of excitement for us, but there's a difference between a bill and legislation, and so we need to get it done to make sure families have the relief that they need.
Thank you so much, Kate. Finally, I will turn over to Sherry Lewand, co-founder and co-president of A Better Balance. She will speak for 10 minutes on the realities of family, medical, and sick leave, and what more needs to be done to support all people in their unpaid care responsibilities. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you to everybody on the panel. You're all fantastic, and thanks to Oxfam for putting this together. A Better Balance, for those of you who don't know us, is a legal advocacy organization that is based in New York City, Nashville, Washington, and Denver. And our mission is to use the power of the law to ensure workers can care for themselves and their loved ones without risking their economic security. And therefore, we are particularly delighted with the theme of this webinar. We've been working over the last 15 years, particularly on paid family and medical leave laws and paid sick time laws around the country and at the national level. And really happy to talk to you all about that today. Next slide. Before COVID, the landscape on paid leave for family and from employees to take care of their families was quite bleak, just as it was with childcare. At least 40% of private sector workers lacked even a single paid sick day to care for sick family members or sick loved ones. And that, of course, fell most heavily on low-wage workers and workers of color. With respect to paid family and medical leave, which is longer-term leave to take care of a new child or a seriously ill family member, the situation was even worse. The United States is the only country besides Papua New Guinea with no national paid maternity leave program. And only 13% of United States workers have access to extended leave to care for a new child or seriously ill family member. The only federal law there is the Family and Medical Leave Act, the FMLA, that is unpaid. It is 12 weeks of leave and you get your job back, but it's unpaid. And particularly for low-wage workers, there are requirements that make it very difficult to access. Next slide. We have been working, there have been coalitions and people working around the country, we've been working with them on laws that have made real progress over the last 10 to 15 years. We now have 8 states and the District of Columbia that have paid family and medical leave laws, and 12 states and 23 localities that have paid sick days laws on the books, entitling families and workers to leave and money to take care of their families. But a lot more progress is needed. There's still no nationwide permanent right to paid family and medical leave or to paid sick days. Next slide. So the crisis that has happened has led to new laws, and it's still remarkable to me that actually the federal government has addressed some of these issues in the laws that have been passed in light of the pandemic. Mostly going to talk about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. There have also been state and local emergency sick leave laws that have been passed in the past 2 months. Next slide. The positive on the Families First Coronavirus Act is that it is the first time in history that the United States has passed any sort of national paid leave law. So it is in many ways something that we should reflect on and be excited about. It only applies to COVID-19 related needs, but it does recognize caregiving, at least of children, as something that needs to be supported. And it is additional to any other leave that workers may have. It was passed in March, effective April 1st, but it will sunset on December 31st, 2020. Those who are covered by FFCRA are those who work for any public agencies, regardless of the size, or a private entity with fewer than 500 employees. I'll say that again, fewer than. So that leaves out the larger employers in this country, which in addition to making no sense, also leaves out millions of workers. And employers can also exempt healthcare providers and emergency responders. So that's kind of the bad news, who is left out. But for those who are covered, it's really a pretty good law. You can take up to 80 hours of emergency paid sick time for a variety of COVID-related purposes, and you can take it immediately. That means that you don't have to have worked for your employer for a certain amount of time. You can take it as soon as you need it. And the 2 provisions that I think are particularly important for this conversation is that it includes the need to care for someone else who is subject to quarantine or isolation, or whose healthcare provider has told them to self-quarantine. And it also applies if your child's school or place of care is closed, or if your child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19. And in addition to the emergency sick time itself for 80 hours, there's a further recognition that caring for children is work by extending family leave, 12 weeks of emergency family leave if your child's school or daycare is closed due to COVID-19. For that leave, you have to have worked for 30 days for your employer, but it is definitely a help and should be a help for those who know about it. There's been some problem with getting the word out for those with children at home during this crisis. Next slide. Another thing that's important to us, we feel like job protection after leave, being able to go back to your job is very important, and that is included. Anti-retaliation provisions are in these laws, and you have the right to your job back after taking time off, with some limits for smaller employers, but generally, this is job protection, FMLA job protection on the extended leave. Next slide. The negatives, as I mentioned, is that it excludes way too many workers, and mostly for workers in large businesses where you know that those employers could probably afford to pay the sick leave. They are not covered by this law, and that's a lot of workers in the United States. And also allowing for the exclusion of healthcare workers and emergency responders is also particularly insidious, especially if they're sick, and Department of Labor has even more broadly define those terms than a lot of us feel that they should have. And businesses with fewer than 50 employees can exempt themselves from the extended emergency paid sick leave requirements related to school closures if it would jeopardize their business's viability. Another little interesting twist is that although you get 100% of your salary up to a cap, if you yourself are sick or need the leave for corona-related purposes, for caring for another, you only get 2/3 of your salary up to a lower cap. Next slide. So in the post-COVID world, I just want to emphasize that we really believe that we can use some of the messages of this crisis, both the public health messages and the economic messages that are not just out there as our messages as we try to get out, over the last decade, but is actually felt by most Americans. And I think that it's really a moment when people really get the need to support people who are caring for others. So we'd love to see that translated into national paid leave laws that are inclusive, that are broad, and that guarantee for all American workers paid sick days. There is a pending bill, the Healthy Families Act, that's been there in Congress for a very long time and has co-sponsors but hasn't moved. The same with paid family leave. Family Act is there in Congress as well. And we'd love to see laws against caregiver discrimination and laws on fair scheduling. And we really do feel like there can be impetus from this crisis to be able to do that. We also need more state and local laws guaranteeing paid leave and protections for caregivers. We are working very hard on all of this around the country and at the federal level. We are part of coalitions and helping to lead coalitions. We urge you to please, look at our website and join the fight. These are really important issues, and I think this is a moment. I think we skipped over a slide. At the moment, there's also impetus in some of the states and localities that we've been working with to do emergency paid sick time laws to fill in some of the gaps in the federal law. And you can visit our website. We have a tracker on those laws, which we're helping with, and links to them. So if you're interested in getting involved, we have those as well. But this, I think, is a good segue into the call to action. So I'll turn it back to Kimberly, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Before we turn to looking at that call to action and then turn to questions, I just want to remind everyone that we have been recording the webinar. And so with that, I will turn to just highlight the call to action, some things that our organizations are recommending, namely that all workers get paid sick and family and medical leave benefits, and that their jobs are protected when they use these benefits. that paid leave can be taken by workers for a wide range of reasons, with a 100% wage replacement rate for low-income workers and a decent rate for other workers. And finally, invest in $50 billion in our nation's child care system to survive the crisis, with additional investments to build a stronger, more equitable system in the long term. So with that, why don't we turn over to a question and discussion period. I want to thank each of the speakers for joining us and providing us with a lot to think about, and doing so succinctly. We have a good amount of time now left for discussion, and it looks like we have a great number and great questions already accumulating in the Q&A section. It looks like we're receiving questions around definitions and evidence and data, questions around public policy measures, and then even some questions around research agendas. So let me go ahead and register a question to get us started. There was a question on definition, just to, I think, open up and get us started, which was around the definition of the care economy and what that means. Nicole, why don't I start with you, turn that over to you to get us started.
Unmute my audio. So I define the care economy as both unpaid and paid care labor, and it includes childcare work, and it also includes work to provide for loved ones, elder care. It's really expansive. It also includes domestic work as well, and so women who work inside of the homes of other families to take care of their families and their homes. So it also, I would include women who do work in nursing homes or in the healthcare industry as well. And so I would say that the definition of the care economy is pretty broad and expansive. It includes a large number of women workers. The service in the service sector. Might anybody want to add to that definition? Expanded.
Let me go ahead and throw out another question then. I'm going to throw one out to Kate. We have a question about how successful or widespread are policies that allow child care subsidies to go to families, friends, and neighbor caregivers who may be doing unpaid care work.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the new CARES money, which folks might be familiar with, CARES was the most recent law that they passed to support families and businesses during COVID. The new CARES money that flows through the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which is $3.5 billion, specifically allows for the money to be spent by what we in the child care community call relative caregivers. And I'll put this in the chat box because we put a blog, my colleague Christine Johnson-Staub put out a blog on this recently. But that specifically allows for relative caregivers to be able to be paid for care that they are providing at this moment. So I think that's a really critical it's a really critical thing for families, particularly families who have low incomes, who may be suffering job loss at this moment in particular, to be able to both provide the care that they need for their children, as well as economically stabilize and support their families. So yes, I will put our link to that in the chat box.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to turn now, Sherry, to you. There's a question around family leave and whether it's only restricted to the nuclear family.
Oh, that's a great question. It's one of our projects actually is to ensure that the definition of family is expanded to include what we like to call chosen family. There are other terms you could use, but really loved ones is probably the most, we had a communications firm come in and tell us that loved ones was a good term to use. So that people can care for anyone who they need to care for. So we have been very successful in expanding paid sick days laws to include chosen family, to include broader definitions of family, particularly at the local level. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, most of the major cities that have passed laws, and all of the laws that have passed more recently on sick time have included broad definition of family. And that is also New Jersey, in passing amendments to their paid family leave law, added a broad definition of family, of who you can care for during the 12 weeks of family leave that they have in New Jersey, 10 weeks. And we are at the moment, in terms of a fight, we are really trying to push that at the federal level as well. I was really happy actually to see in the Families First law that the family member, that it doesn't say family, it doesn't define family, it just allows you to care for people who you would care for ordinarily in terms of being able to get the 80 hours of leave. So that is really a good thing. On the other hand, the extended leave is restricted to sons and daughters in childcare or school closures. And we have certainly heard from the disability community and the elderly community that the concept of care needs to be expanded beyond children. And we certainly agree with that as well. But in terms of family definition, we're working very hard on that issue. And thank you for the question. We'll do the best we can to make it as broad as possible at the federal level as well.
Great, thank you, Sherry. Nicole, I'm going to turn to you for a question around how can unpaid care work be compensated at the household level?
That is like the $1 million question. And again, we would be $1.5 trillion richer, women would be, if we figured this out. So it's been like an ongoing issue and dilemma for us. But I do think that there's something that we could do, and many of the issues have been raised here. I think that, as many of you know, the social safety net has all but disappeared over the last few decades. And what that has meant is that there's no assistance for families to be able to provide for themselves and, their children. There's less than 3% of families receive cash assistance. And I would say that is caretaking, women who are single mothers or mothers who are taking care of their families. So one of the things I like that has happened in the CARE Act, which I think we can strengthen it, is allowing support for women who have to leave the workforce to take care of their families and to be compensated. And also figuring out, again, possibilities for people who are in the house or family or relative who are also providing care, how to compensate them as well. It's a real hard to go, but as another strategy, how about we just raise the wages of women across the board? So, I mean, that would, again, provide some other kinds of support for women workers who are double burdened by taking care of their family and are primary wage earners, and also the caretaking responsibilities that they have. Because one of the issues that working women have who are also responsible for childcare is that they don't have enough, to cover childcare expenses or the, unpaid work, whether, it's providing childcare or even domestic support or help. So there's a lot of other things, but when we crack this bit around how do we get compensated for the, $1.5 trillion worth of trillion dollars of free labor that women contribute to the economy, then, I'll get back to you. But we're all working on it.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to turn to Joy and ask you if you can speak to how this is all affecting older women workers. What's the impact there?
Sure. And again, I'm speaking from a local perspective with the Mississippi data. I think what's unique about Mississippi is 16% of our population is over 65 years old. And so when I spoke earlier, I talked about 8 out of 10 women being cashiers. Well, what we've seen in our data is 10% of those women who are in those positions are over 55 years of age. So what we're seeing is essential workers and women that are being impacted are our aging population. And we need to make sure that that is an issue. We're raising it, and we're trying to make sure that we, as we try to build out our policy agenda and advocate for change, that we're also taking into consideration, in addition to gender and sex, that we're looking at it from an age perspective as well, because what we're seeing, the numbers are showing that there is an increased risk for our aging population, and they're women in these positions.
Thank you, Joy. Maybe you can turn to Kate or Sherry to ask the question around barriers to passing federal maternity leave.
Yeah,
Very
okay.
question.
I can certainly take that. As we, the opposition, like why is there opposition? I think that we've navigated these waters in the States. There is instinctive business opposition to interference with business models, et cetera, et cetera. But we have been able to quell some of that. I think at the federal level at this point, one of the big problems is the pay for. How are we going to, if we have a universal program, how are we going to pay for it? The Family Act proposes to add this to the Social Security structure, and so there would be payroll taxes. But there's a lot of opposition by people who are not. I don't want to make this not a 501c3 statement, but it is definitely a lot of congressional folks and certainly the administration do not want a payroll tax, and that would be the most efficient way to pay for paid family leave. All the states that have enacted programs have done it that way. That there is a central fund. We're very, very small. It's not an expensive program. There's a pay into that fund, and then it pays out benefits. There are other proposals or ideas. I think for most policymakers, the idea that businesses would pay for 12 weeks of leave, and that would be a requirement for all businesses, is something that they are having trouble with. I would also say, though, that the pandemic, I think, has changed a lot of thinking on what businesses can afford, what employers can afford, who should bear the burden of the of payment, because the tax credits for family first payments are such that perhaps that's another idea that this could be paid for. Businesses could pay for maternity leave, or it's not maternity leave, it is parental leave. It will never be maternity leave in this country. It will always be both parents, but that there may be other ways to pay for this, or even jointly, as many European countries where there's some government, some employer, some employee pay in. So. But I think the pay for, at this point, I think that is probably the most critical aspect in terms of opposition. There's still businesses that say, oh, we can't lose employees for that long. But the fact of the matter is you're going to lose employees anyway for at least some of that time. This may just be a longer time. So that's what I would say. And I think people are creatively trying to think of solutions that would be amenable to everyone. But I do want to emphasize again, it's not an expensive program. Even every cost out of this and the way in which the states have done it, it is not expensive, and it should be passed.
Thank you, Sherry. Nicole, would you like to speak to the available data on estimates of women leaving the workforce as a result of COVID-19 in absence of childcare? And then maybe any data already on post-COVID workforce, what that might be looking like.
Okay, sorry. So the data is still coming out around women who are thinking about leaving the workforce. But one of the studies that came out recently is that Latino women, compared to other groups of women, have seriously considered leaving the workforce. There are a lot of reasons why people might leave the workforce, but one of the things that we can conjecture around women who leave the workforce, it's around these dual and competing demands around working and providing care for their children or loved ones. One of the things that's true, and I mentioned it previously, is that only 30% of workers can stay home, and with some of the reclassifications of essential workers, grocery store clerks, postal workers, healthcare workers are all now considered essential workers, but still earning really low wages with little flexibility and no paid sick leave. And so for many women, it's a tough choice, especially if the care that they had prior or pre-COVID is no longer available. And so, it's the closure of the daycares, it's the lack of family or relative care for not wanting to expose elderly grandparents to the virus or mitigating risk, but it's also some working parents, and I'm one of them, rely on care apps like care.com or other things, and those also are not a resource. So many women are leaving the workforce. And one of the things I think we have to know is that when women leave the workforce, because when things open up, it's not going to be a one-for-one replacement of those jobs lost, that competition will be fierce in the labor market. And if we lose childcare slots or there are fewer centers, it's really going to be very difficult for women to make their way back into the workforce, into the labor market.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Just some more questions about what the realities look like for different women, and wondering what protections are in place for immigrant women. Yeah. I don't know, Sherry, Nicole, I want to jump in with that.
So what has really been disheartening with some of the care measures is that immigrant women or undocumented people were left out of many of the provisions, including the stimulus check. Again, I don't know if it's a rumor or reality that many people in Puerto Rico have not yet received the stimulus checks that were promised to all Americans. And so, in addition to some of the other before pre-COVID, where many immigrant women and families were really struggling to make, ends meet, and again, with very few work protections, the pandemic has just exacerbated the conditions and situations for those families. And in my opinion, I don't think many of the relief efforts that are coming out have been as mindful of the reality of immigrant women and families, especially as we know that many immigrant women have been employed because of status, have been employed in the shadow economy and have been paid under the table for their services. And so those numbers, by the way, are not counted in our official unemployment numbers, but we know that those people, those workers are disproportionately impacted. And again, talking about unemployment insurance, not being able to tap into that as a resource as well. So there's some real big fixes that need to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything Nicole just said. I think, the unemployment insurance situation has been particularly dire for undocumented workers. And but I do want to emphasize that the sick leave provisions in Families First should be available to undocumented workers just like they're available to any other worker. There's no restriction. And I think we've all, advocates have all agreed about that, but the DOL has not disagreed. So I just want to emphasize that that is at least one thing that's there. But it's totally, especially over the last few months with so many businesses closing, unemployment has been more important and it hasn't been available. As we reopen, sick leave may become more available. So I just want people to understand that should be there for undocumented workers as well as others.
Thank you for saying that. Sherry, in terms of the sick leave.
Yeah, thank you both. And maybe just expanding to ask a similar question around the impacts for women and families with disabilities. And then to that too, Nicole and Sherry. Yeah.
Sherry, did you want to start? We are actually, IWPR is in the process of producing a report on the impact of the pandemic on women with disabilities and as care workers and thinking about that question, but we don't quite have, we're still wrapping our head around that question. And again, you know, what we are seeing is that women who live at the intersection of race, class, gender, immigrant status, ability, all, you know, this pandemic is impacting them in different ways. And so I think, in thinking about our response and call to action, making sure that we're able to think through how our different relief efforts will impact and be available to different communities. Sherry?
Yeah, no, that's great, and I would look forward to that report. I think, I'm sure it'll be really helpful. I think we are really starting to, the disability community has really emphasized to us, and I think, I alluded to this before, there's a lot of attention to care for children in this pandemic. The disabled, people who need care, who give care, with respect to those who are disabled, we're not talking about them, and they are also particularly impacted by the pandemic and the availability of care workers to come into homes and things like that. So we're definitely trying to talk about that, but in a broader sense, also thinking about those workers and the care needed for disabled people. In our public policy, I think that is really important to lift up, and that's a work in progress, I think.
Can I just layer in on that, since I didn't touch on disability in my slides, is also from the childcare angle. I don't think it has always been the case that children with disabilities, obviously depending on what their nature of their disability is, sometimes require special specific types of care. And so finding that care available is often very much a challenge for families that has pulled families out of the workforce, particularly mothers. As we are confronting a future with reduced care options, lots of families who are already facing difficulty getting the type of care they need. So families that include people with disabilities, families who, have maybe different linguistic needs in their care, all of those families who had specific barriers to care before, we are deeply concerned that those are going to be exacerbated going forward, especially without any kinds of investment right now. And I think, again, from a child development perspective, one of the things that we are worried about is the lack of ability to have well child visits, which is often a moment to identify the need for early intervention. So I think there's ripple effects both for current adults and then also for children, both for the children themselves and for the adults in their lives, right? So it's a very multifaceted issue that I think deserves attention across all of the different fronts. And so grateful to hear about the work that IWPR is going to be doing. And I know Sherry has, and A Better Balance have really pushed for inclusion on that front.
Great, thank you, all of you. Again, just kind of picking up on some different issues of different groups of women and men in this. Nicole, there's a question regarding if we have disaggregated data on trans women and trans men in care and unpaid care work and their realities during this time of COVID-19.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So we don't have information. There is not a lot of available information on transgender individuals, transgender people of color, LGBT, lesbian, gay workers as well. We just, unfortunately, that disaggregated data is virtually non-existent. There are some, we're just starting to, again, at IWPR, really start to think about how do we gather that information. If it's not by, you know, publicly available data, how do we partner with some of the other research think tanks that might have available access to this kinds of data? But one of the things that's true for me and what we know is that the communities that were struggling pre-pandemic you know, living with a low the poverty line, lower wages, which I would say transgender communities and individuals and folks are doing worse at this moment, especially when we factor in the kinds of discrimination, workplace discrimination that transgender folks experience. It becomes exacerbated in this moment, especially if we talk about workers who are working outside of the traditional economy or the labor market. There's definite need for disaggregated data by gender identity as well as sexual orientation.
Great, thank you. Just a couple more questions around the different realities and experiences of different groups during this time, and then we'll switch to some policy questions. We have a question around what the percentage of essential workers are women, specifically women of color, and how does this impact gaps in childcare services and support? So I don't know if Nicole and Kate sort of want to double up and answer some of those questions.
So I actually do have this number, and so I'm going to, because I asked this from, I was doing a presentation a bit ago around this, and so I'm gonna come back to me. I'm pulling it up right now, but I have these numbers for you, and even if I put it in the chat. Off the top of my head, I do know that for Latino women, it's 26% or 27%. If you're Black women, they're 28% of not essential workers, but workers who are in the service sector. So again, they're disproportionately impacted. And how many women are social? So the New York Times, we just got this yesterday, but 25.3 million people are considered essential workers. And I'm sorry, I'm reading this in real time. And with this essential workers not from home, about 44 to 47% are women. But I'm gonna get this. We can send it out. I just want to make sure I'm giving you accurate data and information.
Thank you. I don't know, Kate, if you wanted to speak to the impact in terms of gaps of childcare services and support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think for essential workers, the childcare responsibilities are they're very dire. I mean, so you're confronting folks who do lots of different types of jobs, right? You have people who are healthcare workers who may not be able to safely be with their families, who are working non-traditional hours. You have people who might be doing more work as grocery store clerks who also feel overexposed to the virus and are disproportionately exposed to the virus, and so face a new set of risks. So I think you have questions both around what kind of care do I feel most comfortable with for my child? What kind of care would I like? A lot of parents at this moment are really looking at care in what we call non-congregate settings, so smaller groups of care, right? But then there's also what's available to people. And states have had a range of responses here in terms of setting up their emergency care. And just to be clear, I've also included a range of different workers. There is not one agreed upon definition of what an essential worker is from a public policy standpoint. I think lots of us have lots of thoughts about who should be considered essential. But for example, even in the childcare space, sometimes childcare workers have been classified as essential and sometimes they haven't. So there's lots of different pieces that go into this, but I do think, once again, no surprise that mothers are really bearing the brunt of this as they are both having to work these essential jobs to support the economy and at the same time being faced with trying to find safe, nurturing care for their children in a way that makes them feel supported and comfortable with how they're leaving their children when they go to work.
Thank you. Nicole, I'm so glad you're here with us because we have a lot of questions on just the realities of this, this current situation to a lot of different groups in our society. We have another question regarding Native American women and families and the impact on them. Do you have any data on that?
Well, so what IWPR does not have the data on that. We do have what we do know, and I think we all at this point have seen and heard that the number of Native Americans who have been impacted by COVID, both infections but also deaths, has been disproportionately higher than the number of Native Americans proportionately in society. And so again, when we think about who we don't have enough data for, Native Americans is one of those groups. And so it's hard for us to really understand outside of some of the data we have from like the American Community Survey, what's happening in those communities. But what we do know is that the resources that were not available before pre-COVID are also missing, and the inequalities have been exacerbated. What I found very interesting in thinking about Native Americans and the COVID response is the trampling of tribal sovereignty around COVID, and many states and many state governments infringing upon the rights of Native communities in terms of being able to protect their communities and make decisions that are right for their tribes. So, again, even in our work and research, we've been in contact with some tribes and thinking about, again, trying to figure out how we might do a status report on Native women and families.
Thank you, Nicole. So I'm going to shift us a little in terms of some questions that are more related to public policy, and start with a really broad one, kind of open it up to all of you to jump in and speak to. So broadly, there's a question about how can we make public policies to encourage more equitable distribution of care work.
So, I'm sorry, but I'm sorry, but I think that there are a few things happening. I think that, I think we need to address some of the cultural norms and gender expectations that are shaping public policies. That's really important because there is an expectation and not enough national conversation about why women are expected to bear the brunt of 100% or nearly 100% of care work. And so I do think we need a larger dialogue or conversation. And then, the same thing that happens with paternal leave policies, even though they're on the books or employers implement those policies, because of gender norms and expectations and fear of retaliation, people don't take advantage of these kinds of policies or feel like they will be penalized. And in the same way that when women are, choose not to stay home and provide care, even though that's the expectation, that she faces a different kind of penalty. And so in terms of at the policy level, I do think that a lot of it is, Sherry, I'm sorry, and this is not a fight, it's really changing hearts and minds around this, because even when you talk about the fact that we don't have a paid sick leave, we don't have, federal maternity leave or all these other policies, it's actually human beings that are blocking this. It's not, it's people. And legislators, both at the federal and state levels, that are preventing some of these really important measures from becoming law and institutionalized. So, so I think there's work to be done around, that piece of the work.
I don't be sorry. I mean, I just said, and I do think that that's really right. I think that I think care, first of all, elevating care, and that's one reason I feel like this is an opportunity. Elevating how important care is number one. I mean, it's not just that women are just doing it; it's also that the work is. I mean, it's both. They feed off of each other, but it's the idea that care work is just something that gets done and it isn't very important, and it is really critical to our society. I mean, so I totally agree in terms of the dialogue and the need for conversation about this. I will say, and because I did see some of the questions in the chat, we hold up in terms of a policy of a paid parental leave policy, some of the European countries that have said it's use or lose. But it's use or lose here in terms of at least the public policies, not the private law firms or employers. But each and every state law and the ones that we are trying to get passed at the federal level give 12 weeks is now pretty much the norm for each parent. So, obviously in a single parent home, that's not necessarily going to help you, but actually it's 24 weeks if where there are two parents take it. And the problem is that we haven't been talking about it that way. It's men who don't take that leave are shortchanging their families in a sense. And we really have to start talking about it. It's, there are these, it's per parent. Everyone should take that time to care for their child, and children probably need more than 12 weeks where their parents are totally available in the first year of their life. So I do want to lift that up also, is that we have to start talking about the responsibility for care and how important it is for the society, but also that there are policies that can be taken advantage of by both men and women, and they are not. They're being disproportionately taken advantage of by only women.
And also, I just want to echo what Nicole and Sherry have said. I think it's changing people's hearts and minds and also starting the conversation. But beyond that, specifically in a state like Mississippi, where you have a lot of poverty, I think that it's critical to go into the communities and educate women about these issues. Because a lot of times, and I think, Nicole, you said it earlier when you started talking, when you don't know better or you don't know, and that's the way you taught to push through, then that's the mentality you have. So a lot of times when we're going in communities and having town halls, some of the things that we're talking about are foreign concepts to particularly Black women about what they should have and what are their rights. So also, I think in addition to changing people's hearts and minds and having conversations, there's a really, really critical piece about educating Black women in underserved communities about these issues as well.
I was going to ask, Joy, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm wondering if you can speak to, so one of the things in the childcare space that we're always thinking about is who's at the table making these policies, right? Like, who are we talking to as we're thinking about what the policies are, who the policies are responsive to, what people's needs are. So we talk and think a lot about, again, in the childcare space, parent advocacy groups, parent leaders, and how they are and often aren't at the table. And Joy, given your in-state work, I'm wondering if, again, putting you on the spot, you can talk a little bit about sort of the flip side of what you were just talking about. Like, what are you all learning to shape the policy from the folks on the ground who are directly impacted?
So we have a saying called "nothing about us without us" that we use oftentimes. I think that's really important. So before we shape our state policy, we're having these town halls or conversations with coffee because we want whatever that we're pushing to be reflective of what people need, not us telling them what they need for themselves. And I think that ties in, it's different than education, but I think, we use it as an opportunity in these spaces, safe spaces, to educate and then have a conversation about, well, now that you know that this is an issue or this is what more progressive states are doing, what do you feel that you need to be most secure in your job and to feel secure and supported and be able to work and provide for your family? And that's what we've done across the state. It's been really successful, and it's been an opportunity to, not, like I said, not just educate, but listen. Because I think as we build out policies, a lot of times, you're right, it's people who are at a higher level talking about what people need instead of like going local at the bottom, starting at the bottom and building it up and to be reflective of what the community needs. So I think that that's what we're doing. That's our approach. And it's worked thus far well in Mississippi and Louisiana.
Joy. Kate, maybe just staying on the childcare issue, are you aware, early child care education a campaign issue for any representative at any level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually, to be totally frank, one of the challenges in the childcare space is that everybody says that they're for childcare and for children. Like there's actually like a fairly small, not non-existent, but fairly small number of people who are actually like not pro childcare. And so in some ways it makes a complication for the advocacy work around, well, what does it really mean to be for childcare? And a lot of that I think is around how much support are you willing to put forward. I mean, I think Sherry has certainly experienced this in the paid leave space as well. I know Nicole and others at IWPR have in the pay equity space, right? There's lots of people who will pay lip service to it. But then the question is, what does it mean like when the rubber hits the road, so to speak? But I do think there's lots of champions at the state level, federal level, national level. As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, you know, there's a new bill that may actually already be out and may have happened during our time together, led by many people, but including Representative DeLauro from my home state of Connecticut and Representative Scott from Virginia, really pushing for what childcare and what families need in this moment. So yeah, there's champions out there for sure. But if anyone wants to talk to their member of Congress about the importance of childcare and other family policies, as we have discussed today, that never hurts. So.
Great. Maybe we can end with, start to wrap up with a couple, two again, big questions. There is one just about how we can advocate for long-term change and not short-term relief to COVID only. So how do we maybe extend that work we're doing around the short-term relief related to COVID, but build from there out for longer-term change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question that you just raised right before, in terms of, you know, your representatives in Congress and at the state and local level, is a really good one. They should be held to the fire. I mean, we do have champions. Representative DeLauro has been an amazing champion all these many years, as have many others in Congress. But I think that wherever you are, in whatever state, whatever you know, locality, you need to be, you know, people need to be bringing this up. They need to be saying these are important issues: paid leave, childcare, you know, support for caregivers. Those are all really important issues. And Congress, you know, they react, especially, and sometimes what I found, especially at the local level where you've got fewer people, there is some response. There is some feeling that, oh, well, if this is important to my voters, then maybe I should think about it. So I think that is one thing that really needs to happen, is for people to prioritize these issues when they are talking to their representatives at all levels.
Thank you, Sherry. One other question that takes us slightly different direction, but there's a question regarding the business case for employer-supported childcare in the COVID-19 context. I don't know who would like to take that on, maybe Nicole?
Yeah, so, you know, this is my jam. I love talking about the role that employers should be playing in this moment. And frankly, not enough have stepped up to the plate. So I do, you know, in addition to strong policies at the federal and state levels, in addition to changing hearts and minds, we also need employers, big employers, to also become invested and think that care work, paid sick leave, you know, are good business decisions. And in fact, there have been the business case model written for, I know, paid sick leave, and I'm never going to forget this because I keep saying this all the time. So I really think that we have an opportunity for us to reimagine an economy that works for all women and women workers. You know, we have done businesses, I'm going to keep this short, but this is my new thing. businesses, when millennials came into the workforce, there's so many articles you can just Google about like how to accommodate millennials in the workforce. You know, they like to dress casual. They like to, have open spaces. They need a whole campus, and there's been accommodation for those workers in the workforce. But that same thing has not happened for women workers. Even though women workers make up close to 50% of the workforce, there hasn't been special attention by employers or accommodations made to accommodate women in the workplace. And we know what women need. So we need flexible work schedules, we need childcare, we need, there's a lot of other things that women need to be successful. And so I do think employers have a role to play in terms of shaping how we move forward, and whether or not we'll regress and go back, or, I can't help but wait to see after, we start lifting the stay-at-home orders, the big refrain, I believe, is going to be, we can't afford it. And so I think we're going to need public-private partnerships with employers to, make the business case, and also that the case to be made that we can't afford $50 billion to invest in the childcare infrastructure. I'm also all about, because we're not going back to normal, I do think that employers can pay to subsidize childcare. If we're going to think about where the money should come from, I think employers can subsidize it in the same way, again, that some employers pay off student loan debt. So this is not foreign. It's just that we're not having the conversation and making it a part of reality and a part of the negotiation around what women workers need.
I'll just tack on, because I totally agree with Nicole. I think absolutely employers have a role to play when it comes to childcare, but I think the slippery slope, which I know Nicole is with me on, is that it can't be only employers, right? Which would never be, right? So like it's a both and response that requires big federal money, but also requires employers to do their role. And like, it's not like they're doing anybody a favor. This is going to be helpful to them and their business, right? And their workers and their retention. So it's really, for paid sick leave, for childcare, it's a win-win. And I do think that public-private piece coming together is going to be very essential to get it across the finish line.
Thank you both. I know we have a number of questions that still are unanswered, so I just wanted to let everyone know what next. We will share those questions with all the speakers so that they can directly, there can be direct follow-up around any of those questions, if that makes sense. And we will also be sending out to everyone who has participated, a link for the recording of the webinar. We will share the chat notes as a form of notes that you can see from the webinar. And we can provide in that email some sense of resources from each of the organizations for more information. And lastly, I just want to thank all of our speakers for joining us and teeing up this discussion about this important issue right now. And thank you to all the participants for joining. And look for the follow-up from us, just so you have a record of all of this and can share and reach out directly with further questions and ideas for collaboration. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time.
It was great.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.